Tina never believed in birthmarks. To her, moles were just skin things, random, quiet, meaningless. But pain has a way of making you notice the details. After her husband left, after the job let her go, after the nights got too quiet, she started noticing the things no one ever taught her to look at. Like the small, dark mole at the center of her throat, right where the words used to come out wrong. She remembered something her foster mom used to say: some wounds don't show up as scars, some speak through your skin. That was the night she stood in front of the mirror and asked, what if my body has been trying to tell me something all along? Welcome to Wisdom of Feng Shui. If your body carries signs you've always ignored, this story might feel a little too familiar. So stay with us, and if you notice something on your skin, drop it in the comments below. We're listening, so stay with us. And if you've ever felt like your body remembers things you forgot, this story might whisper something you need to hear. She didn't know it yet, but her journey had already begun. Tina hadn't noticed the mole at her throat until everything around her went quiet. Not just the silence of a house after someone leaves, but the silence inside herself, where words used to live. She'd lost so many things lately. A marriage that grew too sharp, a job that never quite fit, friends who slowly drifted out of her phone. She thought it was just bad timing. But then one evening, as she stood in the mirror washing her face, she saw it. A dark little dot right at the base of her throat, almost like a period at the end of a sentence she never meant to say. It wasn't big or raised, but it felt heavy, like it had been holding something for her, quietly, for years. At first, she brushed it off, but over the next few days, something about it stayed with her. The placement was too precise. Dead center, where the voice rises from. The part of the body that tightens when we feel unsafe to speak, when we edit ourselves, when we apologize before even saying what we mean. She started remembering moments, small, forgettable ones on the surface. Pauses in meetings where she second-guessed herself and let someone else finish the sentence. Times she said yes when every cell in her body wanted to say no. Moments she walked out of conversations feeling smaller, foggier, more unsure than when she walked in. And then came something unexpected. In a quiet late-night scroll, she found an old Eastern healing chart on energy flow through the body. The throat, it said, was not just a place of voice, it was a bridge between heart and head, between thought and truth. In Feng Shui of the body, this area is known as a crossing of two winds, what we carry and what we release. A mole placed right there isn't random. It marks something stuck, something inherited even. According to ancient texts and some modern practitioners, if the mole is dark, flat, and centralized, it often relates to suppressed expression, difficulty asserting boundaries, and a life pattern of being misunderstood. Not because you lack words, but because you learned to doubt them. Tina had never thought about it that way, but when she looked back, the signs were everywhere. She had always found it easier to write than to speak, easier to stay agreeable than risk friction. What started as survival became personality. And now, standing at a life crossroad, she began to feel how much energy had been trapped there. So she decided to try something different. No big declarations, no forced affirmations, just one simple ritual. Each morning, she placed her fingers lightly at the base of her throat, breathed in for a count of 4, and let it go slowly. She imagined warmth moving through the tension. She wore a piece of blue lace agate, not because someone told her to, but because it felt right, cool, calming, like a small kindness wrapped around her neck. She didn't expect the mole to vanish. She didn't need it to. What she wanted was presence, and maybe forgiveness for the years she'd muted herself, thinking that was the safer way to live. Weeks later, during a quiet afternoon of sorting old boxes, she found a photo that made her pause. It was Maria, her old friend from cosmetology school. They hadn't spoken in years, but Tina remembered something strange now. Maria had always joked about how money never stayed in her hands, even though she worked all the time. And Tina, for the first time, remembered the odd little mark Maria used to have, right in the center of her palm. There was something about Maria's hands Tina never forgot. Always moving, always working. At the salon, they brushed hair, shaped nails, handled cash with that natural rhythm only people born into hustle carried. But there was also something restless in them, like they could never quite hold onto anything. In the photo Tina had found, Maria's palm was half open, frozen mid-wave, and right in the center sat a dark mole. It wasn't big, just bold. Tina remembered seeing it once while they were eating lunch years ago. Maria had laughed it off, said her grandma called it her curse coin. Money comes in, money disappears. She thought it was just a joke back then. But now, with everything Tina had been learning, it no longer felt so random. In classical face and body reading, a mole in the center of the palm is more than just skin deep. It's known as the open vault mark, on the rare side but powerful. When the mole is small, round, and lightly colored, it's believed to signal a person with gift in commerce, someone who knows how to generate wealth. But when the mole is dark, sunken, or jagged, especially dead center, it often reflects an inability to retain resources. Money comes, but it slips away through generosity, chaos, or unresolved ancestral patterns. Tina remembered how Maria used to help everyone. Paid her cousin's rent, sent money home, bought lunch for coworkers without thinking twice. And yet, she was always behind. It wasn't from lack of work. It was like something in her hand was wired to release. There's something beautifully symbolic about the palm. It's how we receive, how we give, how we create. In energetic terms, the center of the palm is a gate point. It's sensitive, connected to heart energy and flow of abundance. A dark mole there can mean unresolved guilt around having money, or even deep karmic ties that associate wealth with abandonment or risk. Feng Shui masters sometimes refer to this as a drain in the middle of the bowl, a spot where energy doesn't stay still. Tina thought about that, about how Maria was the most open-hearted person she knew, and yet somehow always empty-handed. Maybe it wasn't just bad budgeting. Maybe her body had been telling the story from the beginning. For anyone with a mole in the center of the palm, the first step isn't panic. It's awareness. It's asking yourself, do I feel guilty when I have more than others? Do I find ways to give it away, consciously or not? Tina had started learning that Feng Shui wasn't just about furniture or lucky charms. It was about relationships. With space, with energy, with self. The palm mole was a relationship wound, unspoken, inherited maybe, but not unchangeable. She took a note from a ritual she found in a book on energetic body mapping. Each morning, she began by rubbing her palms together briskly until heat rose. Then, she would gently press the center of each palm, breathing in the sensation. With a pen, not ink, just a soft pencil, she traced a small circle around the mole she remembered on Maria, as if honoring it, giving it a container. Then, on her own hand, she wrote a word she had once been too afraid to ask for. Enough. She didn't know where Maria was anymore. Maybe she moved. Maybe she stayed stuck in that rhythm of giving until empty. But Tina had learned something just by remembering her. Some marks don't show up on our own bodies. They show up on the people we carry with us. That evening, as Tina cleaned her kitchen and reached for the last dusty drawer, a small envelope slipped out from the edge. Her name was written on the front in a handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her heart skipped, but she didn't open it. Not yet. She simply held it, the weight of it warm in her hands. Tina didn't open the envelope. She placed it gently in the drawer beside her bed, and for some reason, found herself tracing the soft skin just below her own belly button. It wasn't deliberate, more like instinct, like something inside her body remembered something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. There, almost faded, was a mole she'd ignored for years. A small, deep brown dot just off-center under her navel. She always thought it was ordinary, hidden, irrelevant. But now, standing alone in the quiet of her room, she couldn't help but feel its presence like a sealed door with no handle. She remembered someone else, suddenly. Years ago, back when Tina lived in a shared apartment with two other women, there was one tenant who never stayed long. Hoa. Older, quieter, beautiful in a quiet way that made people feel like they couldn't ask her questions. She rarely smiled, never spoke of family, and never let anyone into her room. Tina had barely known her, but she remembered one night when Hoa had come home late, eyes glassy, carrying a small bag of baby clothes that no one ever saw again. There's a theory in body-based Feng Shui that the area below the navel, known as the KH letter 1EA3M palace, holds more than just reproductive energy. It's the basin of hidden truths, emotions stored in silence, pain that was never given shape. A mole in this region, especially if it's close to the center but subtly hidden, is said to mark unspoken grief. The kind that lives in the body like a whisper. Some believe it's tied to loss of control, financial, emotional, or intimate. Others say it points to karmic ties around lineage and unprocessed family trauma. Whether from a broken relationship, a pregnancy that didn't continue, or secrets passed through generations. This mole holds what the heart was never able to speak aloud. Tina had never asked herself why she'd always had trouble fully relaxing in relationships. Why intimacy felt like something she owed, not something she welcomed. Why she held tension in her lower stomach every time conflict arose. The body, it seemed, was a vessel that kept records, even when the mind erased the details. She didn't try to explain it away this time. She simply stood still, one hand resting lightly over the spot. That evening, instead of reaching for her phone or turning on the TV, she drew a warm bath. In it, she added crushed ginger, coarse salt, and a single handful of dried calendula petals. As the water rose, she whispered, not words, but breath. Long exhales, gentle release. The ritual was simple. Submerge the lower belly under warm water, palms resting softly. No rush, just breath, body, and time. Afterward, she massaged the area with oil, not to erase anything, but to recognize it. To say this too was part of her. Not all grief is loud. Some lives inside you like a quiet weight. Not broken, just buried. Later that night, when Tina looked in the mirror, the mole was still there. Same size, same place, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a doorway. She walked back to her bed, pulled the blanket to her waist, and for the first time in a while, her hands didn't reach for distraction. They rested. Somewhere in the stillness, she thought of someone else, someone from childhood. A man who only visited once a year, whose voice she could barely recall, but whose face was mirrored in her own. And she remembered something else too. The way he always turned his left ear slightly away, as if hiding something. The memory came without warning. It wasn't vivid, but it had weight. Tina was maybe 8, sitting at the edge of a family gathering she barely understood, watching a man pass by with a half smile and distant eyes. He didn't stay long. No one spoke much about him. All she remembered was that he always leaned slightly to one side when hugging people, as if he didn't want his left ear seen. That, and the uncomfortable stillness that entered the room when he did. Now, decades later, lying in bed with the warmth of ritual still lingering on her skin, Tina found herself reaching up, fingers brushing just behind her own right ear. And there it was, something she'd never paid attention to. A tiny mole tucked into the soft curve behind the lobe. It wasn't new, but it was quiet, like a door no one had knocked on in years. It's a strange thing how certain parts of the body rarely get touched, rarely get noticed. The area behind the ear is one of them. But in energetic mapping, particularly in Eastern metaphysics, it's considered part of the memory gate. Not just for sounds, but for secrets. A mole behind the ear, especially on the non-dominant side, is thought to represent withheld truths, unfinished conversations, and emotional restraint learned too early. This is the mark of the listener who never interrupts, the child who noticed everything but said nothing. It shows up in people who carry their family's silence as if it were duty. The mole itself doesn't speak, but it remembers. Sometimes it lives on the same spot a parent had theirs. Sometimes it forms after loss. And more often than not, the person wearing it is the one who grew up learning that their voice was safest when hidden. Tina had always been that way. Observant, careful. Even as a teen, she kept her thoughts tucked behind politeness. She heard more than she ever let on, and it showed up in her adult life, in the way she let people vent without reply, the way she nodded instead of objecting, the way she held back even when she knew something wasn't right. She thought she was being kind, but more and more, she realized it came from a deeper place. Not kindness, but a habit of self-erasure. The mole behind the ear wasn't about loss of voice like the one at her throat. This one was about inherited quiet. It marked the places where sound was stored, not blocked. A backlog of things unsaid, not just hers, but those passed down through generations. To honor it, she didn't speak. She listened. That week, every evening before sleep, Tina cupped her hands behind her ears and sat in silence for 5 minutes. No music, no podcasts, just the room, the hum of the world. The space where things might rise if given permission. Some nights, memories came. Not sharp, not detailed, just feelings. Other nights, there was nothing but breath and stillness, and that was enough. She also added a small ritual, placing 1 drop of calming oil just behind each ear before bed. Lavender or frankincense, something gentle. Not to erase the mole, but to soothe the memory it guarded. It became a kind of quiet apology for not listening to herself sooner, for carrying silence that never belonged to her. What surprised her most wasn't how emotional it made her, but how physically lighter she felt afterward. Like her shoulders had been tilted forward all this time and finally remembered how to rest. In the quiet that followed, Tina's thoughts wandered to a photo she hadn't looked at in years. Not of people, but of a place. A beach she once visited on a trip that felt like a different life. And something about it stirred a familiar ache, Not sadness exactly, but a pull. A name she hadn't spoken in years floated into her chest. Not someone she'd lost, someone she'd left. The name stayed in her chest long after the silence ended. It didn't ask to be remembered, it simply showed up. Like most things that mattered in Tina's life, it had waited quietly until she was still enough to hear it. And just like that, she was no longer in her bedroom. She was standing barefoot on that beach again, waves brushing over her ankles, sky low and gray, the wind gentle but cold. That trip had been a lifetime ago, but her body remembered it. Especially the feeling of standing there, not knowing whether to stay or to go. Back then, she had walked away from someone who loved her, not because she didn't feel the same, but because she didn't believe she could be trusted with that kind of peace. She thought chaos was her currency. She thought love meant running when it got too quiet. It's only now, years later, that she noticed something that had been there the whole time. Just above her ankle, slightly on the inside, another mole. Dark, low, easily overlooked, but always there. The ankle, in both Feng Shui and Eastern body reading, is a threshold. It represents movement, transition, our relationship with stillness versus flight. A mole near the ankle, especially on the inside curve, is often associated with restlessness rooted in early disruption, people who struggle to stay, people who feel safest while moving, even if there's nowhere to go. In some traditions, it's called the wanderer's mark, not romanticized, but marked by avoidance. Tina had always traveled light. Even in her own home, she kept things minimal. No attachments, no clutter, no framed photos of people she wasn't sure she'd keep. That mole, so close to the ground, mirrored the very energy she built her choices around. She never called any place home without feeling the itch to leave it. But healing doesn't always come in big revelations. Sometimes it shows up in patterns. She had started seeing it, how she avoided commitment by making it look like independence, how she distanced herself by claiming boundaries, how she kept herself from belonging anywhere so she wouldn't have to feel the grief of losing it. That night, instead of walking her usual loop around the neighborhood, Tina stayed in. She lit a single candle by the floor, sat near it with her legs folded beneath her, and placed one hand gently over that mole near her ankle. She didn't ask it for answers. She simply thanked it for carrying her, even when she didn't know where she was going. There was a simple ritual she adopted from a barefoot grounding practice she once read about. Before bed, she stood at the open door, feet on the threshold. One inhale, one exhale, no shoes, no plans, just skin to earth. She didn't move. That was the practice to stay. That mole, like all the others, hadn't appeared to punish her. It wasn't a flaw to erase or a mark to be afraid of. It was a reminder that even when she was running, something in her was still trying to come home. The body never forgets. It doesn't force. It just waits. Quietly, patiently, through every detour, through every choice that didn't work out, through every moment Tina thought she had to do it all alone. And now, one breath at a time, she was learning to return to herself. Tina never expected clarity to come from her skin, but that's where it started. Not in the mind, not in a book, not even through someone else's words, but in the quiet, forgotten corners of her own body. The mole at her throat, the memory in her palm, the heaviness under her navel, the silence behind her ear, the restlessness at her ankle. They weren't flaws. They weren't curses. They were markers of lessons passed down, of grief unspoken, of power waiting to be reclaimed. She didn't erase them. She learned how to listen to them, and that changed everything. Feng Shui isn't just about the room around you, it's also about the room within you. If something in this story touched you, stay. There's more to unfold. Subscribe to Wisdom of Feng Shui to keep walking with us through stories that heal, not just explain. And if there's a mark on your body you've always wondered about, maybe it's time to ask it what it knows. Your space speaks. Wisdom listens.